Chair. She will be serving as our moderator for today's event. At this time, I'll hand it over to Renee, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Kayla. Everyone, if you can place your questions using the Q&A feature, our speaker will address the questions after her presentation. Now for our speaker. Rosella Kennedy works to build inclusive communities. To this aim, she founded Brave Sis Project, and her book, Our Brave Foremothers, won a 2024 Nautilus Award as one of their better books for a better world. On the global stage, she has served as Director of Impact and Equity for a global strategic advisory firm, and she's on the Advisory Council of Opportunity Collaboration, another global organization. Educationally, she attended the prestigious Brearley School in New York, earned her BA in English Literature and French from Tufts, and then went to Paris for graduate school at University Sorbonne. She lived in Paris for 7 or so years. After that, working as a writer, managing editor, educator. She's also been a published columnist, including working with Proximate Press, which is an independent media platform addressing democracy and public participation on a global scale, again. She's worked for outlets such as Sports Illustrated, Mothering Magazine, Oxygen.com, and NY1 News. She's founded 3 nonprofits. Some fun facts on a personal note. She's lived in Santa Fe in the Bay Area, now lives in Seattle. She is married to composer and conductor John Kennedy. Married nearly 30 years, y'all. 30 years. And she's the extremely proud mother of 2 adult daughters, both living right now in New York City. So everyone, please join me in welcoming, put up some reaction emojis, thought leader, author, facilitator, global citizen, researcher, storyteller, our colleague in community, beloved community that we're going to find out about, Rosella Kennedy.
Thank you. My goodness. Renee, I'm gonna hire you to be my hype woman everywhere I go. That was just beautiful. Thank you so much. And welcome everyone. We want to get the slides going here. But I want to welcome you all and give great thanks to the Centerstone Ambassador Circle for inviting me to speak with you today. And special thanks to Kayla Spikes, Renee Wilder, and the awesome Centerstone team, especially the IT crew, for all of their partnership building this event. So just really, really much gratitude to you all. We can go to the next slide. So today's session will provide an opportunity for open-minded and open-hearted awareness of how BIPOC, that is Black, Indigenous, People of Color, I like to say Black, Brown, Asian, and Indigenous, but BIPOC is more used, so we'll stick with that today. How BIPOC women in history, you're going to gain awareness of them and also get a prism into how to capture new narratives in order to build a broader sense of worth and valor. And I believe this awareness can help us see communities of color more fully and interrogate some of the default narratives in our society, which we all adhere to some extent, regardless of our race, ethnicity, culture, or class. And in so doing, we can begin to strengthen our practice in providing supportive behavioral health care. And so next slide, if you would. So who am I? Renee just gave a wonderful introduction. I'll say a few things. I'm the author of Our Brave Foremothers, celebrating 100 Black, Brown, Asian, and Indigenous women who changed the course of history. And that did come out on Workman Hachette last year. I'm the founder of Brave Sis Project, which offers history, learning, awareness, and sisterhood for BIPOC women and their friends. Founded in 2019, Brave Sis Project uplifts Black, Brown, Asian, and Indigenous foremothers and sheroes to help build an individual practice of deeper awareness, self-care, and pride. I really believe that without this individual self-work, the work is not sustainable and it is often inauthentic. And that's through no fault of our own. Those are just the pressures of the society and the norms within which we live. So Brave Sis offers publications, history lessons, which I call sistery lessons, events, speaking, workshops, and facilitations such as this. And as Renee said, having served as an impact and equity leader in the global strategic advisory space, I'm now honored to continue service as a thought leader and trusted advisor to individuals and organizations from the local to the global. I just on Sunday returned from co-facilitating a 3-day interracial sisterhood retreat in San Francisco, where 30 more or less, maybe more, women from across the country ranging in age from 20s to 80s gathered in a spirit of deep listening, collaboration, decentering default narratives, norms, and reactions. And together we started to build some very strong bonds and shared purpose for building beloved community. And I believe I will send some follow-up information about, this concept of beloved community for you all to start to consider integrating into your thought processes. There were moments in this, I just want to speak a bit more about this because there were moments in this retreat that were potentially tense, but I was pretty pleased with my facilitation skills helping us understand some of the typical reactions that we each can have to unpleasant truths and lived experiences, some of us only know from the outside. What was so spectacular about this event was that it gave our white women participants the opportunity to understand and visualize what some of the BIPOC women's lived experiences were, as well as an essential lesson in what Skip Gates says: there are 47 million Black Americans and therefore 47 million different ways to be a Black American. I'm talking about this event before I launch in just to say that this was a quantum leap forward for these well-intentioned white progressive women, and it really represented a new paradigm for building deeper trust, connectivity, mutuality, and understanding. And so that is something I want to just point out before we start today. In my practice, it is my belief that allyship cannot be claimed. It must be conferred upon one by the people that one wishes to be aligning with. And I can talk about that more at the end if we have time, because I don't want to get too far off the topic right now. I delight in engaging with individuals and groups interested in moving beyond DEI and into lasting, sustainable mindset and power shifting to create lasting equity, justice, and liberation. These photos on the bottom is my grandmother, Alice Green, who was born in 1919. She is no longer alive, but I believe it was her foremother spirit that came to me on Christmas Day 2019. I felt a presence saying, "Tell my story." And that was the launching pad of Brave Sis Project and the way I started looking for stories of sheroes who should be household names but aren't. And we'll look at 2 of those today. The other photo is just from this weekend. That's my mom, who's 86, at the family reunion they just had in Charleston, South Carolina. And, my mom is just a real inspiration. She's had a beautiful, complicated, and not easy life, and she's found her grace and her place in the latter years of her life. And she's such an inspiration to me for how I can continue to use story and truth to move things forward. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Thanks for listening to all of that. So I want to speak just shortly about beloved community. The beloved community is one that embraces and creates harmony among all in living together. First formulated in 1913 by Harvard philosophy professor Josiah Royce, he wrote of a place where everyone worked toward the cause of loyalty and truth. And this concept is most widely associated with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was an admirer of Royce. And King expanded upon this philosophy, adding the imperatives of the civil rights era. He asked his followers to strive for a goal of reconciliation, saying, The end is redemption. The end is the creation of a beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opposers into friends. It is this kind of understanding and goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles. I think that's an amazing quote for us to integrate in these times we're living. Now, upon Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh took up the mantle, dedicated himself to championing the memory and legacy of his friend. Speaking of King's death, Hanh wrote, "When I first heard the news of Martin's murder, I was devastated. I could not eat. I could not sleep. I made a deep vow to continue building what he called the beloved community, not only for myself, but for him also." Thich Nhat Hanh also added this sense of beloved community extending beyond the human relation to the larger beloved relationship we can have with all sentient, all creatures and nature itself. And then a while ago, I came upon the Religion and Race website, wherein Dr. Arthur Ray Wright, an ordained deacon in the Methodist Church, laid out 25 tenets of beloved community. And I will share those with you. I'll have those shared with you after this presentation. Some are liturgical in nature, but many of them struck me as actionable goalposts and groundings for how we can live out our values. So I base a lot of the work I'm doing now in that notion of beloved community. How do we get past whatever we're holding individually to keep our eye on the prize of the people and the causes and the missions that we're trying to serve? So with that, we can move to the next slide and I'll dive into my presentation. So we're going to garner inspiration from the story first of an Indigenous woman who has been largely erased from history. Life dealt Ada Blackjack unlike many of the male lions of the era. She was less interested in fanfare and more into getting stuff done. Baker once said, "You didn't see me on television. You didn't see news stories about me. The kind of role I tried to play was to pick up pieces or put together pieces out of which I hoped organization might come. My theory is strong people don't need strong leaders." Next slide, please. Ella Josephine Baker was born on December 13th, 1903 in Norfolk, Virginia, and she grew up in North Carolina. Her early childhood motivation came from her grandmother, who had been enslaved and who shared the stories of the abuse she endured with the young girl. Next slide. Her grandmother was once whipped for refusing to marry the man chosen for her. Because, as most of you may be aware, back then, enslavers did not consider their human chattel as any more dignified than horses or cows to breed and increase their wealth. Bet Ross, Ella's maternal grandmother, continued to radically assert joy in her life, going to all the plantation celebrations among the enslaved, not letting herself be broken. Next slide. And this provided a real inspiration to how Ella would live her life. These lessons, along with her grandmother's resilience, inspired the young Ella when she attended Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. She spoke out against policies that she thought were unfair to students. Working 2 jobs and serving as the youngest contributor to the campus newspaper ever, her leadership was already emerging, and Ella graduated as class valedictorian in 1928. Following graduation, Baker moved to New York City, working first in journalism, but changing her focus once the Great Depression arrived. She understood that hard work and resilience were proving not to be enough. People had to fight for financial stability. Ella went undercover as a domestic to understand what that life was like, and she co-wrote an expose called "The Bronx Slave Market." Exploitation, cheating, and abuse of Black domestic workers was, she revealed, a Northern thing too. By 1930, she had organized the Young Negroes Cooperative League, a group designed to advance Black business owners, build economic mobility within the community, and battle white-owned businesses who exploited and blackballed Black-owned companies. Next slide. Thank you. The ravages of the Depression, however, made it clear that even more citizen action was needed. The intersections of poverty, homelessness, and civil strife were taking a toll. So Ella dug in even more deeply into the cause, accepting an invitation to join the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which had been formed back in 1909. By 1941, this overachiever was field secretary. Her role was to go around the American South, raising money and recruiting new members to the NAACP. It was not safe to do, but she came from brave stock. Next slide. And she made a huge impact. One of the people who learned from her facilitations was a young woman named Rosa Parks. Ella ultimately grew frustrated with the organization and its lack of focus on grassroots activism. So she resigned in 1946, but she would return in 1952 to lead its New York chapter. Ella also ran for a seat on the New York City City Council, seeking to effect change at the grassroots and policy level. And unfortunately, as you can imagine, she wasn't successful in that run. But as you can also imagine, she was used to this coming up against sexism and bureaucracy throughout her career. And we'll see that trend would continue. So next slide, please. Excuse me. The interesting thing about these movement spaces is that they can be circular, right? So I told you that Rosa Parks was inspired by Ella Baker. Well, Ella Baker became inspired by the bus boycott in Montgomery, of which Rosa Parks was a linchpin character. So inspired by that protest, Baker co-founded a group called In Friendship in 1957. This New York City organization raised money to aid local movements in the South, and it engaged in civic activities seeking to uplift the race. You may be familiar with the expression lifting as we climb. That was one of the keynote slogans of the movement for women's Black women's club groups, which was a way of demonstrating education, poise, good manners, and what we today refer to as respectability politics. It was a way of breaking with the negative stereotypes of the enslaved people and of African Americans as being backwards. And so these groups such as this not only wanted to show that women, and men as well, but this was women-based groupings, were able to not only provide their own self-determination, but that they were inspired and positioned to provide mutual aid and what we today call cooperative economics. Next slide. So I want to just speak a little bit about Mary Church Terrell for a second. She was the great Tennessee suffragist and civic leader who coined the phrase lifting as we climb. Mary, who helped start the National Association of Colored Women in 1896, along with Harriet Tubman and Ida B. Wells, fought for the women's right to vote. Now, unfortunately, as I earlier mentioned, the suffragist movement's white leaders were only interested in securing that right for white women, and this was due to the prevailing racial discrimination of the time in both the South and the North. One example that I'll briefly touch upon is the story of Ida B. Wells, who, when told that her Black women's suffragist movement would have to stand at the back of the parade, simply stood on the sidewalk until the marchers came by and then slid into the protest. This was actually courageous, but also supremely treacherous in this era of rampant lynching. So despite these travesties, many Black women of the early 20th century upheld the value of using women's clubs and other social gatherings to do good works for the Black community, both in the South and up north, by promoting education and the finer things in life. So next slide, please. On the heel of that formational moment, Ella took more activation and brought it into the context and needs of the burgeoning civil rights era. Working out of New York, but also active in Atlanta, Ella met the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1957, and she became an organizer for his newly formed Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. Over the following 2 years or thereabouts, Ella helped the organization plan protests and hold activation events. She trained leaders of local chapters in resistance. She planned protests, and she held events to further SCLC's aims. She traveled throughout the South, giving speaking engagements. And, this was still a very unsafe thing, an unsafe space for racial justice activists during this time, as we all know. Next slide. Now, we love to look back at the civil rights movement as an era of freedom, and of course it was overwhelmingly. But there's another side to the story that is important to consider if we want to fully embrace history, and that is sexism within the movement. Remember, this was the late 1950s and early 1960s, a time when all women were treated as subservient to the men in their lives. Many of you know or remember that women of any race were not legally allowed to have their own credit card until 1973, for example. And within the constraints of respectability politics and the draw of the big charismatic male leader, women were supposed to be the support system, bake the cookies, make the fried chicken, set up the chairs. Well, Ella wasn't having it. She was not there to serve the proverbial potato salad. She had lived experience and she had ideas of her own about leadership. She spoke her mind to Dr. King, letting him know when she disagreed and offering her own viewpoints about how to advance activism. His so-called preacher ego and her get-it-done grit did not a love match create. So this is not a real photo. This is a montage, but it's to give you a sense of that tension, right? King balked at the notion that a woman would have ideas beyond his. An early SCLC member said of King's behavior that it was just a consequence of his time and circumstance, saying, unless someone was male and a member of the inner circle of the church, it could be difficult to overcome the preacher ego. And greats of the era, such as Fannie Lou Hamer, were told that their role was to step back and let the men come forth. Next slide. And so Ella left SCLC in 1960. There was some student activism taking place in Greensboro, North Carolina, and she actually compelled Martin Luther King Jr. to donate $800 to start a group there in support of the protests. This group ultimately led to the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Leveraging her NAACP connections, Ella helped lead voter registration drives and train local leaders. This early approach of giving those living in the problem the space and resources to find the solution is a forerunner example of the kind of localized and proximate leadership we speak of today in equitable philanthropy, humanitarianism, and community building circles. Next slide, please. As Ella put it, give light and people will find the way. Next slide. I would like to take a minute to talk about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which Ella founded with the great Fannie Lou Hamer in 1964. These women wanted to integrate Mississippi's all-white Democratic Party, and the efforts came to a head at the 1964 National Democratic Party Convention. 68 Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegates arrived, arguing the case that their state's party was discriminating by excluding Black people in Mississippi. The party's official weak offer of 2 delegate seats for the MFDP was a flat-out rejected. Fannie Lou put it this way: "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats." And as we know, the struggle for voting rights and racial justice in Mississippi has not evolved in satisfactory ways, even 6 or 7 decades later. Next slide, please. Around this time, Ella became active with the Southern Conference Education Fund, the SCEF. Aligned with SNCC, SCEF sought to engage white Mississippians of good faith to take part in the civil rights struggle. They hired Ella as a consultant, and she played an ombudsman and advisory role. We like this because much of the work Ella had done until this time was unpaid. Black women must be paid. So SCEF had its origin in the early 40s, part of the Popular Front movement that joined liberals with socialists and communists to fight fascism. And they also saw American racism as fascistic. This group was ahead of its time in understanding that racism hurts white people too. In this case, Mississippi's deeply seated racism created economic and social problems for the entire state. And so it remains. So this group, SCEF, was led by a white activist named Anne Braden. And I want to take a minute to acquaint you with this civil rights activist, journalist, and educator, because it really demonstrates how we can work together across racial, cultural, ethnic, and class divides to bring about important social outcomes. Anne and her husband were staunchly dedicated to racial equality, and they bought a suburban house for an African-American couple during the Jim Crow era. They stood in alliance with the couple even as white neighbors burned crosses and bombed the house. Anne wrote and organized for the Southern Civil Rights Movement well before these actions became national news. She was among the nation's most outspoken white anti-racist activists, organizing across racial divides in environmental, women's, and anti-nuclear movements. During the McCarthy era of the Red Scare, Anne was charged with sedition and blacklisted. Well, Ella Baker defended her friend in the court of public opinion. And I love this story because it's a story of interracial sisterhood and support that goes deep and two ways. And I find that a very inspiring model. Next slide. Ella also took action for her Black brothers and sisters. She was a generous mentor, inspiring up-and-coming activists such as Diane Nash, Bob Moses, and Bernice Jackson Reagan, who we know just passed away last week. Let me share a little bit about Diane Nash, just to give you a sense of the power of mentorship. The recipient of a Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2022, she is a civil rights activist who shored up some of the most successful civil rights campaigns of the era. These include lunch counter integration in Nashville, the first successful such campaign in the nation, and organizing with the Freedom Riders to desegregate interstate travel. Nash was also a co-founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and co-initiator of the Alabama Voting Rights Project, and she worked on the Selma voting rights movement. This helped gain congressional passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which authorized the federal government to oversee and enforce state practices to ensure that African Americans and other minorities were not prevented from registering and voting. And here she is with Harry Belafonte back in the day, and below receiving her Presidential Medal of Freedom. Now, many of us know who Angela Davis is, and when she was jailed in 1972, Ella became an active voice in the Free Angela movement. She also spoke out against apartheid in South Africa and in support of the Puerto Rican Solidarity Committee, which advocated for sovereignty for the island as well as other causes. Next slide, please. In a 1981 documentary about her entitled Fundi, The Story of Ella Baker, she described her life's work this way: I found a greater sense of importance by being a part of those who were growing. And by the way, Fundi is a Swahili word meaning someone who passes on her wisdom to other generations. So that was one of Ella's nicknames. And as I mentioned, the other was the backbone of the civil rights movement. Next slide. Ella Baker was awarded a Doctorate of Letters from the City College of New York in May 1985, and she passed away the following year on December 13th, 1986, which was her 83rd birthday. Oakland's Ella Baker Center for Human Rights continues her legacy today, working to dismantle the mass incarceration of minorities and to strengthen low-income communities. This organization aims to combat the difficulties of legacy discrimination and policies and systemic racism. And there are a couple of public schools that carry her name and apparently a street in Paris. And yet Ella Baker is not a household name. And so let's go to this last slide. I have done a little research on this. Why isn't she a household name? First of all, she was not conventionally attractive according to the tastes of the era. Dark-skinned and down-to-earth, she eschewed the soft and genteel manner of a Rosa Parks, for example. And we have to keep in mind what a terrible reality colorism is, even within communities of color themselves, due to centuries of internalized racism and in-group discrimination. This is something we dive into some of my facilitations, as well as a forthcoming self-paced course, which I'll share about at the end. A second reason is she did not let the men tell her what to do, and she rejected the simplistic great man mentality of the charismatic leader in word and in deed. She referred to her philosophy as group-based leadership, and it is a model for some of today's movements for localism and proximate leadership, as I said. Back in the day, that was a real maverick and a little too ahead of its time for many. And then third, Ella Baker knew her strength was in behind-the-scenes organizing, and she focused her efforts where she felt she was most successful. So now we can move to the next slide, which is a chance, again, take a little 3-minute pause, and then I think we'll go straight into Q&A. And I'd love for you to think about, and if you want to put your thoughts about this in the Q&A, that's fine as well. How might these hidden stories of resilience influence your direct care with patients or your relationships with people of color? And how might you utilize community within your space or role as it relates to behavioral health care? So we've got just a little bit of time for that, and